just a minute here to introduce our speakers. We're going to hear today from Kate Lister, who is president of Telework Research Network, a research and consulting group that's making the management case for alternative workplace strategies. Kate's team has interviewed the nation's largest and smallest virtual employers and their employees, the advocates and the naysayers, the legislators, the leaders of successful programs, and even some of the venture capitalists. And we're going to benefit from that research. Her team has developed hundreds of custom telework savings models for companies and community leaders to quantify the impacts that teleworking can have. She is joined by Tom Harnish, who's a senior scientist with her organization. Tom's the author of numerous technical journal and popular press articles on topics ranging from physiological psychology, aviation and aerospace, to performance-based management and telework. He has co-authored with Kate 3 business books published by John Wiley & Sons. And I'm going to pull up this little piece from Tom's bio that intrigued me. He's a former carrier-based Navy jet flyer, a civilian pilot, and a flight instructor, and he has over 40 years of flying experience and holds 2 aviation world speed records, so he says, both in aircraft older than he is. So, with that introduction, Kate and Tom, talk to us about the state of telework in the U.S.
Thank you, Donna. Well, we have a lot to cover here today, and we're going to do it in a short period of time, but don't worry about taking notes. Just about all that we're going to be talking about today is covered in great detail in our free white papers. They're available on our website at the teleworkresearchnetwork.com. So let's get started with this. As a former banker and a bottom line kind of person, when we first got into this whole telework thing, I was surprised that nobody had quantified the economic impact of telework. The fact is, just 3 years ago, saving money was rarely mentioned for reasons that companies were turning to telework. In the private sector, it was being able to attract and retain the best talent. In the public sector, it was continuity of operations. Then came the recession, and everyone was focused on the bottom line, and they were finally singing my song. So using data from dozens of well-respected sources, together with the latest census numbers, we created a model that can quantify what companies, communities, and individuals can save through telework. Now, we've built standard models for the U.S., the UK, and Canada, and as Donna said, hundreds of custom models for organization and community leaders. Hardly a week goes by when our telework savings model or other research isn't mentioned in the press. Now, I don't say this to brag. I just want to point out that our work is constantly under public scrutiny. When your stuff starts showing up in the Harvard Business Review, you better be darn sure you can defend it and that you've used highly credible research. In fact, we always try to err on the side of being too cautious rather than too aggressive. Now, you'd think that just something as simple as answering the question about how many teleworkers there are in the U.S. would be easy. It's not, believe me. Several years ago, I was talking to a senior fellow at the National Federation of Independent Business, and he told me that the task of trying to make sense of various government sources of work and home data is a statistical Vietnam. The data goes in, but you can't get it out. And you can see what I mean here on the screen. Even trying to get a bigger than a bread box number is all over the place. Census data says it's about 3 million people. Now, theirs is the biggest survey, but they only count people who say they work at home the majority of the time. Where do you consider your primary place of work is the question they ask. And you have to go to great lengths to extract self-employed from those numbers in all but the broadest reports, which is what we actually had to do to produce the numbers that I'm about to show you. IRS, SBA, Census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they all have their own counts and their own way of counting, but sadly none of them really is an effective measure of what we're trying to get at here at the employee telework trend. Now, there's an organization called World at Work, and every Fortune 500 company in the U.S. belongs to it, except for Costco. And they were going to actually give them a free membership just so that they could say every Fortune 500 company. Anyhow, they say it's about 16 million, but their count is anyone who works remotely at least one day a month. And their survey is based on just 1,000 people. So it makes it really hard to drill down very far into the numbers and still be statistically significant. It's also very difficult with their data to make sure that you've eliminated all of the self-employed. And then there's Forrester and Gartner. They say teleworkers will soon account for between a quarter and half of all employees. Frankly, I don't know where their numbers come from. So the problem of who you count is real. Do you include an employee who takes work home on weekends as a teleworker?
I used to do that years ago. It wasn't called telework then. It's called get your work done.
Overworking.
Yeah.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics, in their work-at-home data, they include anybody that's even working on weekends. Or what about a plumber who has an office at home but earns a living on the road?
Can't fix my toilet at your house, can you?
Or other home-based business owners or unpaid family workers. The census, in fact, lumps all of them into this one work-at-home category. Then there's mobile workers who work at client locations or in their cars or in coffee shops. There's no government data that captures them. And then the question of, how often do they have to telework to be counted? Do you throw somebody that works one day a month in the same statistical bucket that somebody that works at home all the time? For us, the biggest bang for the buck lies in the employee teleworkers who do so regularly, because it's only through frequent telework that you can see the real impact on work-life balance, on engagement, real estate, continuity of operations, traffic congestion, the environment, the corporate bottom line, all of that. And so that's the population that we're going to be focusing on today. We had a meeting with the transportation planning folks at San Diego Council of Government a while back. They coordinate the 20-year transportation plan for 18 city and county governments. We were talking to them about ramping up their telework program. In fact, we even brought our own funding source. What they specifically wanted, though, is data on what role telework could play in plugging the region's 60% gap between projected traffic growth and what the roads and transportation alternatives they already had could handle. And the words they used were, if we're going to take $1 million away from rideshare, we need to know what the payoff will be. In other words, show me the money. And at the time, we couldn't answer that question. Now, as a result of having downloaded the U.S. American Community Survey raw data, we know how many people in a particular geography hold telework-compatible jobs. We can estimate how many could telework based on the regional job mix. And then we can project the economic impact on communities, businesses, and employees. Beyond the transportation demand issues, regional planners need good data on telework for a variety of reasons. It can help them understand how to solve regional workforce issues like outbound talent migrations, talent shortages, labor force mismatches. It can help them understand what role telework can play in reducing un- and underemployment. It can help them evaluate the extent to which telework can cause residents to shop where they live. And it can help them to decide whether to spend those energy, transportation, and other dollars supporting telework programs like leaders in Georgia, Virginia, Connecticut, and others have. The sustainability folks need to know what role telework can play in reducing energy usage and pollution, and how it can serve as a continuity of operations tool in the event of a pandemic or terrorism threat or other problems. Political leaders need to understand how it can impact how zoning laws and tax laws can either encourage or discourage telework. They needed to make decisions about whether to support broadband, public transportation, or other investments. And they need to see how telework can save them money in their own organizations. Now, at the same time, business leaders need good data about telework trends and to better understand their facilities needs, to improve workplace efficiency, and to reduce real estate overhead, for that matter, to remain competitive. They needed to evaluate their information technology readiness and the communications, collaborations, and technology needs of their workforce. They needed to effectively integrate employee mobility into hiring and training and management paradigms, and to better address the special needs of the disabled, military families, and caregivers. And finally, manufacturers and service providers, and even the investment community, needs data about telework trends to better evaluate the potential for products and services that support remote work. So I've already mentioned most of the things on this list here, but I wanted to have you to walk away with a laundry list. One thing I didn't mention that's often overlooked is that non-telecommuters will benefit from the reduced travel times as well. Research shows that for every one-time reduction in traffic, you get a 3 to 5 times reduction in congestion. So let me get off my soapbox about why you should care about all this and get to what we've learned from our recent studies. So first we'll look at the who, what, when, and where of telework, And then Tom will take a look at the why of telework for organizations, employees, and communities. Okay, on this first slide, the first question we wanted to answer now that we had this raw census data in hand is, did telework grow during the recession? Because a lot of folks said that it would actually decline, that companies would want to pull their people closer in, that employees would be afraid of being laid off, and so we would see less telework. Well, the first bar on the left here shows the U.S. workforce, not including the self-employed or people who worked at home. So in other words, regular employees. And what we saw was only about 3% growth from 2005 to 2010. The self-employed are represented here in the second bar, and they were particularly hard hit by the recession. It was actually a decline of over 5%, although in the third bar you can see the self-employed who worked at home suffered less. Now, here's why it's important to take the self-employed out of the numbers. Pretty much any time you hear statistics about who works at home based on census data, they're using just they haven't gone to the extent that we have to try to take the self-employed out, and it paints a really wrong picture. The fourth bar here shows that the work-at-home population grew 23.5%. But if you take the self-employed out of that, the last bar, by the way, WAH is work at home. I forgot to mention that. Take it in the last bar, you see it was a 66% growth since 2005. Again, you can't get that data from regular census reports. So let's drill down a little bit. This shows the year-to-year growth across various types of workers. The top left slide, for example, is for-profit companies, and it shows that they grew 17% from 2005 to 2006, and only 3% in each of the last 2 years. So, I mean, that answers the question. It did continue to grow, but at a slower rate. In fact, for all of these groups, we saw just about the same thing. Strong growth in 2005 and 2006, again in 2007 to 2008. And then all but state government workers showed slower growth in 2009 to 2010. The federal workforce is an interesting picture. The one on the left here showed huge growth in work or homes between 2005 and 2006. Now, that was the year of Katrina, the Oklahoma City bombings, and at the time, record high gas prices. But it's made very little progress since, in spite of federal mandates that require it. The second chart here shows the summary growth of all 5 groups, and again, we see that same spike in the 2005, 2006, and slowing in the recession, but still growth. So the point of this next slide is to take a closer look at that work at home by type of employer. The light blue is 2005, the purple is 2009, and the percent at the top of each column is the percent of the workforce that teleworks regularly. The number in the box is the total 2009 teleworkers. So looking at that federal workforce again, the last bar, it shows great growth, but only 150,000 people do it, or 137,000 in this slide. So you know, that kind of growth sounds real big, but you know, it's easier to grow from a small number than it is from a large number. One of the other things that we noticed both in census and our own practice is that nonprofit telework grew faster than for-profit during the recession. And it appears what happened is that the recession squeezed the not-for-profits more than others. They had to deal with 2 issues, not just patrons contributing less, but their investment values declining as well. So they were really forced to make changes. The chart also shows that state and local governments also lag all of the others in telework. And when you compare U.S. growth to that of other countries, you see that we're behind both Canada and the U.K. What you don't see here, though, is that the U.K., in fact, lags the majority of other EU nations.
And there were 17 out of 23 countries, and we're way behind them.
Yeah. Next slide shows that some of the industry and occupational findings were different than what we expected. Some were the same. The right side of the chart here shows those industries that had more work at home than their level of the relative to the total workforce. So obviously the largest group there is in professional, scientific, and technical occupations. But just about every industry had some portion of the population working at home, and that's shown a little bit better on the next slide.
I mean, anybody that spends all day sitting in front of a computer, it doesn't really matter where they sit.
Yeah, I mean, you can see this. You know, we've got even some showing in fishing and farming and forestry. There's some components of just about every job now that can be done at home. So before we start and take a look at some demographics, let's do a poll. Which age group do you think has the highest percentage of teleworkers relative to their overall population? So who's doing it most? So we're starting to get some answers now. And clearly people are seeing that it's the, I said clearly, but now it's changing a little bit. Okay, well, we'll wait until you're done voting. So push those buttons, get your votes in, vote early and often. Okay, let's close the poll. Well, you're right, actually. A lot of people assume that it's the younger folks that are working from home, but in fact, it's the 40 to 49-year-olds that are working at home more than the relative to the population. And likely, there's two factors at play here. First of all, senior workers have had more time to earn the trust that's essential to telework. And then second, they're less likely to be concerned about opting to work flexibly and how that will impact their chance of advancement. And that's something that tends to be more of a concern to younger workers. But it's not the tech-savvy younger workers that many people feel are working at home. The next slide's not a real big surprise. In terms of education, disproportionately large proportion of teleworkers have college and post-grad degrees, and disproportionately fewer teleworkers don't have a college education. Given that, it's also not surprising that they make more money, but they make quite a bit more money. Over 3/4 of work-at-home employees earn over $65,000 a year, putting them in the 80th percentile relative to the total workforce. Their average income is about $42,000 compared to the general population of $31,000. Something interesting to note, though, that is the call center industry actually led the charge more than a decade ago toward work at home. And there you've got people working at the lowest end of the wage spectrum. And by the way, in some ways the highest end of the security spectrum, dealing with credit cards and social security numbers and those kind of things. So, I mean, it shows that it can be done, and it is being done in a number of companies. Okay, so where are they working? To answer this, we had to turn to some World at Work research, and they asked their survey participants to indicate whether they'd ever conducted work-related activities at one of these locations in the past month. So home was by far the most cited non-traditional place of work. The number came out to be about 63%. And the second most frequently cited location was in the car. And hopefully that is not while they were driving. But I tell you, I see an awful lot of people at Starbucks, too, and it doesn't really show up there. Now, the cool thing about having the raw data on your own computer is that we can finally answer those regional government questions about what's in it for me. In this map here, you see the green arrows show the highest percent of the workforce that teleworks. The blue arrows show where the telework growth has been the greatest relative to the total workforce. So if you look at the big blue box down at the bottom, you see that Riverside, California, their work-at-home population grew 25 times faster than the non-work-at-home population. And the red circles are the ones with the lowest employee teleworkers. And you can see that one of those is, surprisingly, New York. Well, one of the more interesting things that we found in the study was that there's no correlation to the cities with the highest traffic congestion and telework. Now, there was a correlation between individuals' likelihood to telework and their commute, the length of their commute. Another surprise was that our hometown was the #1 top telework communities. And we haven't had time to digest the data fully yet, particularly in other areas. And to be honest, we don't really have that inside information to analyze other cities. But our take on San Diego is that they've got a high level of information industry jobs, higher average income, which may mean larger houses, more accommodating homes. The traffic's terrible. We've had years of major highway construction, terrible public transportation alternatives. I hope nobody from San Diego is listening. And long
survey of one.
long individual commutes. Another thing that I mentioned earlier that planners need to know this and politicians need to know what's going on in their community in terms of tax laws. There's a something that's known as a telecommuter tax in New York, so that if your office, the company is based in New York and you work in another state, you're going to owe taxes to both states.
And your company's going to owe taxes to the state you live in, potentially.
And so I don't know if that accounts for why there's such a poor showing in New York, but it's a possibility. So turning to some other sources, we looked at who offers telework. The Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts an annual national compensation survey, and they ask questions about the benefits offered by companies. But to be counted, it has to be permanent and widely available. So ad hoc, occasional, and informal work-at-home programs aren't included. In 2010, BLS data showed that only 5% of companies offered reporting flexible workplace benefits according to that strict definition. So I call it the 5% privilege. And that number's changed only by 1 percentage point since 2003. The BLS data also shows that workplace flexibility is more available in large companies than small, non-union operations than union operations, and white-collar versus blue-collar. And then the bottom box reinforces that the income side of things. There's a linear relationship between the availability of flexible workplace options and wages through the third quartile. The higher the wage, the more likely the availability. But the highest wage earners are twice as likely to have access to workplace flexibility than those in the third percentile and 12 times more than those in the lowest wage group. What BLS doesn't show is the level of ad hoc telework. And data from World at Work shows that 83% of organizations that offer telework do so on an ad hoc basis. So I was kind of surprised at the poll in the beginning that said a third have a formal policy, because it's just not the norm. Only a small minority of companies have embraced it as a sort of a cultural norm that's available to all employees.
Well, I mean, that's always been kind of an HR perk, it was considered, and it's only recently that it's starting to turn into a corporate strategy, because it's being proven to be,
so valuable,
successful for an organization
beyond HR.
And these training numbers kind of prove that. I mean, it's like, go do it, whatever. There's no structure to it.
Yeah, there's no Six Sigma for telework.
Yeah, exactly.
And it isn't the kind of thing you just send somebody home and expect them to be productive, or tell a manager that they should be able to manage their people without seeing them. This is the kind of thing that needs training. In many ways, telework's this dirty little secret that organizations don't want to acknowledge for a variety of reasons, including that they don't want to offer it to everyone, and perhaps that they don't want to acknowledge the tax and paperwork implications of having employees work in different counties and states. Okay, so before the next slide, what percentage of employees do you think would telework at least part of the time if they were allowed?
So this isn't a quiz. This isn't like we wanted to see if you were listening or not. This is just looking at the group, looking at the people you know. If you gave them the opportunity to work at home, would they want to or not?
When I talk to people, it tends to be polar. They're not like, oh, I don't know, maybe,
not
but they do it.
They're on it.
No, actually, going to the next slide. What we're seeing.
Go ahead and close
that. But what we're seeing from the responses here is that the majority of people think it's in the 60% range, and then on either side, some as low as 40%, some as low as 20%, and only 25% of the people that responded thought that it's, or I guess that's 33% over 80%. So what the numbers actually are, you'll see on the next slide, is that only 11% of the population say they wouldn't work at home at all if given the opportunity. So the other point to this slide is, imagine a utopian society where anybody who wanted to work from home and had a telework-compatible job did. Our research shows that about 63 million U.S. employees hold jobs that could be done at home at least part of the time, and that's 45% of the population. If we reduce that by the number of folks who say they wouldn't want to work at home, we arrive at a number of about 50 million people who both want to and hold telework-compatible jobs. So that's the darker blue and the purple area, and that's the future of telework. And it's interesting because there is a theoretical maximum, and I don't know if we'll ever get to it, but
it's hard for a truck driver to work at home.
But he wouldn't have been included in those numbers. I don't know. Who knows down the line?
That's right. They got airplanes. They get people flying airplanes from home.
Yep.
Almost.
So here's a breakdown of those
UAVs.
jobs that would comprise that 50 million. And again, this is national data, but we can get at this kind of data for different communities as well. So with that, we've talked about the who, what, when, and where, and so
let's shift gears and look at the why. Yeah, I mean, employers, employees, and the whole community benefit from it. The numbers from here on are based on our telework savings model that Kate's talked about. And for the bottom line benefits, just to be assured we're all talking about the same thing here, we're assuming half-time telework. And that seems to be a pretty typical number when you survey the people that are doing it, because it gives them enough time to see the benefits of telework itself, but it also allows them to stay in touch with what's going on at work. So these are the sources of data that we used to put this model together. And at the risk of being repetitive, we tried really, really hard to make sure that the sources are credible and that our assumptions were cautious. As Kate said, when they start showing up in places like Harvard Business Review and Wall Street Journal, you know, when a reporter calls and says, well, how did you come up with this number? You better have a darn good answer. And in fact, what's happened in many cases, we found several sets of values for the very same issues. And the same questions would come up with different numbers. So we had to go through and try to understand why there were differences in the answers and make a judgment about what were the most believable, or actually more to the point, the most accurate.
I also might add that I said that we've done this for the U.S., the U.K., and Canada, and using all different sources for the data and all different assumptions, we come up with about the same bottom line benefit.
Yeah.
So
there's something going on there, yeah. Yeah, there is a consistency in it. We've got a bunch of variables that go into the model. Here's just some of them. There's a total of 59. Some of them are fixed. You know, the number of gallons of gas that you get from a barrel of oil, you can't change that. It is what it is. But how often people telework or how far they have to go. We've even included values like if somebody uses public transportation to get to work, but they drive from home to the train station, we can figure that in as well. So we've tried to cover all of the bases on this. If somebody teleworks, it doesn't mean they stop driving. They still have to go to the cleaners and pick up their clothes. They have to go, take the kids to school or whatever. So we've tried to include all of those details. If you can think of some that we haven't, we want to know about them, because
even for example, one that always comes up is we subtract the electricity or energy that someone will use from their home office, so that we're not claiming that without noticing that there is an increase in those costs.
And for that matter, we keep in mind that if 5 of the people on the floor start to telework, you don't turn all the lights on the floor off. So we know that the reduction in electricity, for example, isn't going to change completely. But real estate and productivity, these are the kinds of benefits that we can quantify. So let's start with productivity and look at it a little bit more carefully. There's the biggest holdback for telecommuting is that employers worry that their employees aren't going to be working as hard as they otherwise would. They have visions of somebody laying on the couch watching TV, or paying attention to the screaming babies, or whatever else seems to turn them on. But actually, the data shows just the opposite is true. The study after study in a wide range of industries and cultures, not just in the U.S. but around the world, shows that home-based employees can be anywhere from 15 to 55% more productive than traditional staff. And the primary reason for that, for all that productivity, are shown here on this slide. Home-based workers, if nothing else, avoid a lot of the interruptions that take place in a traditional office. I mean, you get into work, you take your coat off, you stand around and chit-chat, and so if your work starts at 8, by about maybe 8:30, you start to go, oh, I forgot to get my coffee, so they go to coffee break. And, there's a long lunch, the rumor mills, oh, and now we're going to have a football pool. And, next thing you know, A lot of the day has gone by, and all of those interruptions have changed it. You might be interested to know that a survey shows that Americans spend almost twice as much time as any other culture in meetings. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's fact. Managing your time in the office in any event is tough, whether it's meetings or the interruptions, because someone pops in with a quick question and suddenly you've lost a half an hour, not to mention your train of thought. And I mean, if you think about it, when you get busy and you want to get something done, what do? You go home, you go to the library. I don't know about going to the car, in spite of what that survey says, but nevertheless, you get away by yourself where you can get work done and you don't have to worry about those things. But there's another very clear factor going on with this whole telework approach, and that is empowerment and self-determination. It becomes more obvious if you're allowed to go work by yourself that somebody trusts you, that somebody's going to give you the opportunity to get your work done, and they're not going to tell you to take step A, step B, step C, just get the result that we want. And that kind of support, that kind of empowerment and self-determination is key to unlocking employee potential, and it increases job satisfaction. So that also contributes to the increased productivity. And for those people that can flex their hours as well as their location, telework allows them to work when they're most productive, which isn't necessarily 9 to 5. And then there's just simply longer hours that helps make them more productive. It turns out many employees that work during the time that they would have otherwise spent commuting. In fact, Sun and Cisco both found the same number. They found that employees were giving back about 60% of the time that they would have otherwise spent commuting. So if they normally get up at 7 and got to work by 8, by 7:30 they're in checking emails and going to work anyway.
Well, in fact, overworking is one of the biggest criticisms from the employee side on telework. It's just very hard to turn it off when it's right there in the next room. When we wrote a book called Undress for Success: The Naked Truth About Making Money at Home.
Available in bookstores near you.
And one of the people we interviewed for the book, a teleworker, said that he had so much trouble turning it off at the end of the day that he would get in the car, drive around the block, and park back in front of his house to say, okay, that's it, my day's over.
Which is ironic, considering it's this whole issue of self-determination. It's like, I'm making me work too hard.
Yeah.
So anyway, there's a couple of other interesting facts that are involved here too. Employees admit to wasting 2 hours a day, and that's not including lunch and scheduled tasks and stuff. So so much for the idea is if I can see them, I can make sure they stay working. That sweatshop and typing pool mentality doesn't necessarily prove that they're doing anything. Also, there was a 2010 study that Brigham Young University did. They looked at 24,000 employees, and teleworkers felt that they could work 57 hours a week on average before it interfered with their personal life. Their office-bound counterparts, though, said that after 38 hours they were getting fed up and it was starting to, influence their personal lives. That's a 19-hour difference. And by the way, 38 hours is a couple less than 40, which is the typical work week. So there's a lesson to be learned there for sure. Anyway, so that tells us if you have a half-time teleworker, a typical organization could save someplace between $4,000 and $16,000 per year in just productivity alone. And that's based on an average U.S. salary for telework-compatible jobs and a range of savings from 15 to 55%. So we again made it as cautious and conservative as we could. I don't remember who said it, but somebody characterized it perfectly. I thought it was a Silicon Valley executive, I think from HP, but I don't remember, who said that telework is buy 3, get 1 free, just in terms of productivity. By the way, since we're talking about these numbers and all these other sources and company statistics, let me remind you that the white papers are available on our website, and you're welcome to download them. But before we go a little bit further, let's take a look at this issue of how much we think that industry workers spend at their desk. What do you think? How much time is spent in an office today, anyway?
And this sort of gets to the office space utilization issue. There are consultants that spend their days and days on end, months, standing in organizations and just watching what people do, watching how the workflow happens, watching who's at their desk and who isn't. There's even a chair that can measure whether there's a butt in it. I don't think it actually takes a butt print and knows whose butt it is, but it can tell whether there's a butt sitting in that seat. The polls are coming in here, and it looks like
this is a pretty savvy group. You
I know.
Get the last poll right.
I hate talking to experts. This looks like between 40 and 60% is what most people think.
Yeah, let's close this poll and then we'll move on here. And the reality is that the majority of people don't spend much time at their desk anyway. You guys came very close. It's about 35%. The EGW did a workplace study, and that's what they found. Most of the time is spent in meeting rooms and ad hoc work areas at colleagues' desks and other buildings, out with a customer or a client. Through alternative workplace strategies, companies have gone, though, from 35% utilization to over 70%. It's just, this one, well, I did hear a guy from HP talk about looking around the building and saying, where is everybody? And they decided they better measure it. And they did a very detailed job, and so did Sun.
This goes to that dirty little secret thing, too. There's a lot of companies that don't want to admit, that don't want to have to put in their annual report that they realize they were only getting 30% or 35% office space utilization. I mean, here we're talking about some really tangible stuff. I mean, a lot of people don't want to think about the productivity increase and some of the other things that Tom's going to be talking about, but there's some real evidence that this can really save on real estate. And not just real estate, but I mean, there's some other issues too in certain industries like healthcare and insurance and finance. By allowing telework, you can avoid having a brick and mortar facility in a particular area and still get into that area. So now we're talking about issues like desk sharing and office hoteling and other changes to the office footprint. As a result, companies are able to save money and at the same time better address the needs of their workforce.
So here's some of the real-world examples that we're alluding to. And real numbers, patent office, $11 million a year savings. It's amazing numbers, and they're very hard numbers.
If I had to say anything that's driving right now telework, both at government and in the private sector, any of these money saving, it's the facility savings.
So the math is pretty easy. If we assume an office costs about $10,000 per employee per year, and those are pretty typical numbers, and just 25% savings in real estate, a company could save about $2,500 per teleworker per year. In addition, telework programs can save on electricity, parking lot leases, transit subsidies, and then you go janitorial and insurance and all those other things. And it can reduce the cost of compliance with disability, environmental, and office safety regulations as well, which is not insignificant. Well, then there's the impact of telework on absenteeism. And here's one of our guys, somebody in England when we were over there referred to them as one of the mucus troopers. The unscheduled absence costs employers billions. They require staff redundancies. It's inconvenient for coworkers and not to mention customers, and it reduces productivity and morale. I mean, you can just tick off the things that happen here. Telecommuters are sick and absent less often because why? Well, they're less exposed to other sick coworkers, and they have fewer occupational hazards. And by the way, not the least of which is driving to work, which OSHA considers the most dangerous part of an employee's day. Telecommuters they're less stressed, and that's a known link to a majority of diseases. They continue to work when they're sick. They may be all bundled up and have runny noses, but they can still sit in front of a computer and work, and would rather do that than nothing. And they can get back to work more quickly if they've been out for pregnancy or surgery or whatever. Teleworkers are better able to handle personal appointments without taking a full day off. And kind of silly to lose a whole day's productivity when you need to be there for 2 hours for the cable guy. And they also have more time to exercise, talking about health and wellness. You go out for a jog during the day. It's a lot easier to do when you can control your own schedule. And all that makes them happier. So telework has proven to be the second most effective method of reducing absences. Flexible scheduling, by the way, is the first. The assumptions in our standard model, which are shown here, are based on data from GSA, AMA, and Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the bottom line is an additional savings of about $2,000 per half-time teleworker per year. But then there's the turnover issue. Telework has a huge impact on it. Engagement, if you haven't already noticed, is at an all-time low. According to a recent Gallup survey, more than 70% of the workforce is not engaged. And that's stunned me. I mean, 30% of the people are really involved in what they're doing. The other 70% are checked out. In fact, Gallup said that 20% are disengaged, and they define that as either just wandering around in a fog, or they're actively undermining their coworkers' success.
Like this lady here with a knife.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, I don't want her on my team. Why am I paying her? As a result of the recession, employees are more bummed out, burned out, and stressed out than ever. In fact, a study that was done last June included 30,000 worldwide workers, and it showed that almost a third are seriously considering leaving the job they're in, and there's 5% that are fed up.
No, 20%.
Yeah, a fifth. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. A fifth. 20% of them are fed up. But the worst part is they're not thinking about moving. They're just going to stay there and do nothing.
Just the kind of people you want on board.
Boy. In Dan Pink's best-selling book called Drive, What Motivates Us, if you haven't read it, we recommend it, observes that despite 4 decades of scientific research on human motivation, and I'm reading here, there's an immense mismatch between what science knows and what management does. He goes on to say that while the carrot and stick worked successfully in the 20th century, it's precisely the wrong way to motivate people today. Now, here's a guy. This manager seems to be using a banana instead of a carrot, but I still don't think that that would be any real significant change in motivational technique as far as Dan Pink is concerned. So, what employees of all ages and groups want, as we've said, is flexibility to determine for themselves where, when, and how they work. This is not your grandfather's workforce, or Oldsmobile for that matter. They aren't in it for a gold watch. The Gen Xers and Gen Yers, the millennials, want to do it their way, and they're perfectly happy to change jobs to get what they want. 87% of employees surveyed last year on workplace flexibility would be said that workplace flexibility would be either very or extremely important when they were out looking for a job. Other studies have shown it to be second only to salary in importance to employees. But get this, over 40% said that they give up pay for the ability to work flexibly.
Some pay.
But yeah, yes, thank you. Yes, that good point. Yes, some pay.
The average is about 6% that they'd be willing to give up.
Yeah. Telework offers solutions to staffing issues, not just because teleworkers are less likely to quit, but because it expands the talent pool beyond geographic boundaries. We've talked to folks at Prince Edward Island, and they were trying to find ways to work that didn't involve fishing, and the only way they could think to do it was doing it remotely by telework, which made great sense, and we were able to help put together some statistics for them on that. It also provides companies access to people they wouldn't otherwise be able to reach, the disabled, rural, retirees, and senior caregivers. Did you know, for example, that the percent of U.S. adults who provide care to their parents has tripled since 1994? Those people otherwise might not be available to the workforce. They wouldn't have an income, and you might be missing a really good employee. The consensus is that turnover costs someplace in the range from 75 to 200% of an average employee's compensation. So if you assume a middle ground and a 10% reduction in turnover, the savings potential adds up to over $1,300 per employee per year for a typical organization. But remember, we're talking about something like $77,000 per retained employee, and that's a chunk of change. All told, a government agency, a company, or an educational institution, if they had 1,000 half-time telecommuters, they could save $11 million a year. Talk about a chunk of change. That's a bunch. And the benefits don't stop there. Some that we haven't quantified in the model include reduced health care costs. We're working on that part, by the way. Reduced transit subsidies, better continuity of operations. I mean, that was one of the reasons that telework became important early on. And in some cities and states, there's even tax incentives, grants, and free training available to companies and organizations. So there's all kinds of advantages to doing it that go beyond the strict numbers that we've incorporated here. Now let's take a look at it. Let's do another poll here. And given what I've been talking about and what Kate said in terms of the costs and benefits, what do you think the ROI, the return on investment for teleworkers is?
This is the federal government's own estimate, and they sent a lot of bean counters out to figure this out, and measured some actual situations.
Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock.
So we're seeing, looks like the consensus is somewhere around 10 times. Give it a couple more minutes here. Okay, why don't we close that one out, Phil? So we've got 63% of the people saying 10 times and 26% of people saying 100 times.
Well, guess what? Booz Allen did a study of federal government telework programs, and they estimated that the return on investment was up to 1,500 times. What's more, Office of Personnel Management's own estimate of government-wide telework, they estimated it would cost about $30 million over 5 years to do it, to roll it out. But here's the amazing thing about that $30 million. That's less than half of what OPM themselves estimated to be the one-day loss of productivity from a huge snowstorm, hurricane, or terrorist threat in Washington, D.C. alone.
In fact, when that statistic first came out, they said they lost $100 million a day. And a couple of days later, they came out and said, oh, wait a minute, no, we only lose $70 million a day. And that difference of $30 million was the people that were already working from home. In fact, is only about a third of company or government employers cover home office technology or other costs. And this is a good gig for employees. They want to work from home, and they're typically willing to make the investment.
Also keep in mind that most, if not all, of the costs associated with a telework program, the IT upgrades, the training, and so forth, they're investments that organizations need to be making anyway if they expect to be competitive and effective in today's economy.
The employees have already left the building. It's just about catching up with the way people are already working.
So with employer benefits in mind, let's take a look now at how employees and communities can benefit from telework.
Telework offers employees a way to save 3 of their most precious commodities. Depending on how many caramel macchiatos they consume in a typical workday and other factors, the annual savings add up to between $2,000 and $9,000 per employee per year, per half-time teleworker. And they can gain back 2 to 3 weeks of time they would have otherwise spent in traffic or riding public transit. And Tom's already mentioned some of the health benefits. What that translates into is happier, healthier, and more engaged employees. This guy's performance review, for example, said he was outstanding in his field.
Yuck, yuck, yuck.
God, it's hard when nobody laughs. But as I said in the employer section, or as Tom said, that's not all. We haven't included all of the potential benefits, the things like elder care costs. I mean, car insurance, we typically put 7,000 miles a year on a car compared to the typical average of 15,000. So all those are savings that, are on top of. And then there's sustainability. I mean, there's simply no cheaper, easier, or quicker way to reduce your carbon footprint. Something organizations are going to need to pay increasing attention to as carbon taxes, supply chain requirements, and environmental sanctions start to impact the bottom line and appropriations. At the national level, if the 50 million U.S. workers who hold compatible jobs and have a desire to work from home did so just half the time, we could cut our Persian Gulf imports by 45%. The greenhouse gas impact would equate to taking the entire New York State workforce off the road. If you've driven in New York, I think you'll agree that's a good idea. And the energy savings would total more than double what the U.S. produces from all renewable energy sources combined. So the bottom line on the bottom line, for half-time telework, combined company, employee, and community savings would total over $500 billion a year. Now that's a stimulus package. So before we move on to my favorite part of these kinds of programs, hearing from all of you, I just want to point out that this slide is a tidy takeaway summary of all the numbers that we've been talking about so far. So Phil's been watching your questions and comments, I think, as they roll in, or maybe Donna has, and we'd like to hear from all of you.
Thanks. Kate and Tom, thought-provoking and assumption-challenging statistics. It was really interesting to guess what the numbers were and then learn what they were. As folks are getting organized to ask their questions, I get to use moderator's privilege and ask first. And you make a very persuasive business case for how and why telework makes sense. So my question is, so how come we don't have more of it? What's the underlying issue, and how do we address that?
Well, I didn't know you were going to ask this question, but I have a slide here that I haven't, it wasn't part of the presentation, and it really just covers the three main reasons. And that's trust, and trust.
I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
There it is. Blew my. It's just that issue of.
Did I really say that? And why the blankety blank not?
The letters, it stands for heck.
There you go.
It's the typing pool and sweatshop mentality that Tom talked about. Managers are just not taught to measure measure their employees based on results, and it really takes that to get to the point where you can say, you know what, I don't care if you're on the golf course at 4 o'clock on a Thursday. If you meet your goals, if you get your job done, I don't care where, when, and how you do it. I mean, management gurus have been telling us since the 50s that the way to motivate employee, the way to get the best out of your employees, the way to make them happiest and most engaged is to give them goals, to work with them really, to develop those goals, to give them the tools to meet the goals, and then to just get out of the way. And I don't care what you call it, every organization we walk into has a different answer, but it about why they're afraid of it. But it boils down to they just can't imagine allowing their people to work untethered. They just don't believe they're going to be working.
I have a little bit of a sense that it's at least a part of the issue has to do not so much with not trusting their employees, but managers not trusting themselves. I had the opportunity to stand in the back of a presentation while Kate was doing a presentation up in Silicon Valley for a bunch of executives, and noticing when they were shaking their heads and which way, it became pretty clear to me that one of the big problems for them, and thus for anybody that's trying to institute a telework program, is finding concrete ways to measure by productivity what the exact measure is. Now, if you work in a call center, that's easy. If your employees are salespeople, it's easy. Either they made their quotas or they didn't. If you've got a programmer, it's maybe not quite so easy because they might be able to write 10,000 lines of code, but how maintainable is it, and how many errors did it have in it, et cetera, how many bugs. So getting to that, I think if companies can focus on, and organizations, government organizations, can focus on the measure of productivity, and that goes all the way to the bottom, and it has to start at the top for that matter. It has to go through the organization, which is why I was talking about it as an issue of a corporate philosophy, not just an HR perk.
Okay. With that little pause with me asking my question, the questions are flowing in from our audience, so let's move to that. One of our participants would like to know what kinds of impacts telework have on companies' insurance. You need different insurance?
Oh, no, that's an interesting question. There's been a lot of high-profile, media-rich stories. I shouldn't say a lot. There's been several where the employee's at home, trips over their dog, and sues their employer. And about the third time I saw one of these, I started calling around to some of the really large telework companies. companies with all virtual employees, people they hire virtually, train virtually, and manage virtually. So I called, I guess, about 6 companies and asked them, what's been your experience with workers' comp claims and other insurance issues for people who work at home. They told me 0. Every single one of them told me 0. And then I was up in Sacramento last week, and I was speaking at a conference where Scott McNeely, the former CEO of Sun, was speaking. 18,000. Had 18,000 people, 18,000 teleworkers, and he said, never. We never had a workers' comp claim or an insurance claim.
So then I started digging into these reports that you see in the press about the woman that tripped over her dog, and there was somebody else that was attacked by a neighbor and sued. When we got down to the bottom of it, we found out that none of those cases were found in favor of the complainant. So even that was bogus. This is a good gig. People don't want to screw it up. I mean, it makes them happy. It makes them more productive. And they'll do whatever they can to make sure it works.
Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't document and you shouldn't protect yourself as an employer. And that's why the ad hoc nature of a lot of these programs is really poor management. You need to have the rules in place. For example, who's going to pay for your drive to work if we do call you into the office? What is covered and what isn't covered in insurance?
That's the reason formal policy is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One of our questioners would like to know which country in the world leads with openness to teleworking. It was her assumption that it was the U.S., and so she's interested.
Oh, no, not by a long shot. Because like we said, we're 3rd behind Canada and the U.K., and the U.K. is 17th behind the 23 EUs. And I wish it's almost on the tip of my tongue, but it's like Belarus or
well, the Netherlands
Bulgaria.
Is very high.
Yeah, Netherlands is too, but that country. We talked about it being a corporate philosophy or an organization-wide philosophy. They made it a country-wide strategy. They said if we're going to be successful, if our economy is going to be successful, we're going to have to start working with the rest of the world. And they have been very successful, and I'm embarrassed I can't name the country.
Yeah. The number of Scandinavian countries are very high. India is very high.
There,
yeah, it's cold. I mean, that's a big issue. But it's interesting, some of the motivators in different places. Tom mentioned Prince Edward Island. Africa is also looking for a way to retain their population but increase the standard of living by giving them access to better jobs. In Ireland, they've got a very highly trained workforce, but not a lot of opportunity.
One that I never would have thought of, but in the Far East, one of the reasons they like telework is it maintains, what's it called?
Islamic country.
Islamic, I mean, yeah. It's the polite phrase is it prevents gender mixing.
Right. Well, and in China, where you're obligated, it's morally obligated that you take care of your own elders. You don't put them with somebody else. This is becoming popular as a way to allow people to do that.
Interesting. One of our questioners wants to know if you have a template that employers can use to formulate a formal telework policy. Website, is there something there?
On our website, lots of places on the web. In fact, you can go to the federal government's website and get their policy. You can get the poster that goes on the water cooler. I mean, if you were doing this 10, 15 years ago, you'd need to be making it up as you went along. But now there's just plenty of free resources for how to make a pitch if you're an employee, how to pitch it, how to put together your own business case. What the policy should be, what the individual policy should be between the teleworker and the employer, just all kinds of great stuff that you can get on a variety of websites. And forgive me, I don't know if you can get it at ACT or your organization, but if you can, go ahead and chime that in, Dinah.
Some of the folks from the Telework Council, I'm sure, could provide that kind of information.
Yeah.
Another question a question about a particular industry. Have you found that colleges and universities are incorporating telework and online classes as a means to manage facility costs, reduce parking, and reduce space needs?
You would think so. A lot of them are turning to virtual education.
That's fine for the students, but
they don't trust the teachers. and you know, there you're talking of real cultural norm of big buildings and big offices and august offices, and you know, there's a big cultural barrier to overcome there. You know, I think it's starting to happen, but it is kind of funny that we were just talking to a fellow in Sacramento last week that said, you know, we do, you know, offer 80% of our courses online now, and none of the teachers are allowed to telework.
That said, we have a friend who's has a master's degree in art, and she teaches online. She has never been in a building to teach, and she does all of it online. So,
interesting trends both ways. Productivity question. One of our participants would like to know your opinion. Is there a certain point at which too much telework can have a negative impact on productivity?
Absolutely.
What happens to team dynamics?
Yeah, I think what the disadvantage to telework, aside from overworking, for the employee is a lack of visibility. And that puts a huge pressure on their managers and bosses to maintain to represent them throughout the rest of the company or organization or, you know, institution. And unless that happens, and that's why training is such an important piece of it, unless they're trained to do that and understand how to do that and provide their employees with the resources they need to remain
socially connected.
Yeah, socially connected, then it can be a real detriment. And that's why we've always used the number of you know, half-time telework, because that the other half of the time that they aren't teleworking, then they can be maintaining those connections and those associations and interacting with the people that they need to, and then they can go home and get productive.
But that's not to say that it can't be done. As I said, in the call center industry, one of the other companies that we interviewed for the book was MySQL, the largest open source database company in the world. They were acquired by Sun and then by Oracle, but back then they had employees on every continent except Antarctica, and they never met their employees. And the head of HR said we could have never become the company that we became. And you know, we're talking a pretty collaborative process of software development, but we could have never achieved the kind of success that we achieved without being able to hire the best and the brightest from all over the world.
I mean, the three founders were on 3 different continents, and they never had met in real life.
You know, they would have things like virtual birthday parties and virtual history days where, you know, everybody would go out with a camera and take pictures of what they did on History Day, and they'd come in and they'd share it. There are companies that are experimenting with games to sort of create that collaboration and that esprit de corps.
Yeah, my son works for FedEx. He's a technology guy there, and his boss was worrying about the troops up in Alaska, and are they getting the kind of support they need? And Scott said, "Oh yeah, of course they do. You know, we get together every Friday afternoon and play World of War, and in that, you know, while we're doing that, the issue will come up. Well, what about that server over on such and such a location? Oh, no, it's been taken care of." So even when they're working, even when they're playing together, not only are they getting work done, but they're creating that corporate culture that's so necessary.
And this is why I would really, really like to see the more formalized programs, because the ad hoc, they're just not thinking through these kinds of things, and they're important issues.
One thing we didn't mention that people always seem to bring up, and I don't know why we didn't ourselves, is security. And it turns out if you go talk to the heads of security groups, they'll all tell you that the people they're worried about are the ad hoc teleworkers, not the ones that have a formal program. And if you look at the major disasters, the portable that had all the Social Security numbers for VA in it, that was a guy that just took his portable home on a weekend and left it in his car, and somebody stole it. I mean, he was not a teleworker.
And it's not even security with technology. And Tom and I were sitting in a coffee shop one time and listening to this, you know, person speaking loudly on the phone, as they often do, about his strategy with the investor that was coming to meet him there. And he's saying, well, you know, I'll go up to about 48%, giving away 48% of the company, but I'm not going to start that high. I'll start down around 20%. Well, there's a guy sitting behind him that's very interested in the conversation, who a few minutes later got over and sat down and introduced himself.
Entered the negotiation.
Yeah, he's a shrewd negotiator, that one.
Too much. We learned from one of our beginning polls that most of the audience is in the business of marketing telework to other companies. So one of our participants would like to know what strategy might get employers, the decision makers, to believe the numbers and to address the issues of trust that seem to be a barrier.
Yeah. Again, right now it's show me the money, but all of those factors that led to the talent shortages of a few years back are still there, and they're going to come back with a vengeance for a lot of the reasons that Tom talked about when he was talking about turnover. Already in Canada, parts of Canada are paying $15 an hour at McDonald's because they can't get people to work for them.
They're closing stores at 4 o'clock because they can't put in another shift at the end of the day. There's just nobody to do it.
So, you know, every business is going to be different, and that's sort of fundamental. You can't treat them all that, you know, oh, just take these numbers and, you know, multiply your people by it. You know, you've got to find the pain point, whether it's bottom line benefits, whether it's real estate or turnover or absenteeism or whatever the issue is, and then try to make the management case with them and make them part of it. You know, one of the things that we can do with the calculator is change those 59 variables to model, you know, just them. So these are your numbers, and it's shocking. I think every time we've shown them,
they're stunned. It's like, what? This is my organization. These are my numbers. I had no idea. You know, it's a kind of myopia, but it's also a cultural thing. And as other companies do it very successfully, like Sun has, and like AT&T has, and like HP has, and just the list goes on. Go look at the bibliography in our white papers. It lists the source for all these successes. We're not making them up. And as other people begin to learn about that, then I think the process will become more easily adopted.
And speaking about successes, are there companies that you think have particularly noteworthy manager training programs for telework? Is there somebody out there that's really doing a good job preparing their managers to be successful at managing by results?
Well, there's a couple of companies that have some real good tools to do it. A company that we like and have worked with, eWork.com, has a interactive template that leads people through a lot of these issues of, you know, overcoming the obstacles in a variety of ways, and, you know, what it really takes to work at home. And then some companies are creating them themselves. Certainly Cisco, Citrix,
AT&T, IBM for sure. They have a huge number and a very effective training program.
Yeah, a lot of the insurance companies, finance industry, a lot of the big companies are really catching on to this and seeing it as something that they need to train for.
Okay. And speaking of training, one of our members wonders whether one of the problems is that we haven't included telework in business school curriculum. Is that a strategy that we should be pursuing?
It's interesting. There's a woman who's just one of those junkyard dogs that gets on a cause, and she's after that one right now.
You mean that in a nice way. Yeah, she's wonderful.
The nicest junkyard dog we know, right?
Exactly. I can't think of her name right now, but anyhow, she's now latched onto this, and one of the things she brought up is trying to change that whole cultural thing by using not just educators, because no, it's not being taught. I mean, results-based management has always been taught. But not mobility. It's just now starting to find its way into some curriculums. But the other thing that she's saying is, you know, let's make movies about it. You know, let's include it in the TV shows and not The Office.
Yeah, not The Office.
You know, there's all kinds of ways to go about making this sort of something that's normal in society.
Sounds good to me. Well, we have
telework is the way to work.
There you go. We have whizzed through a program that I knew was going to be thought-provoking, and I hope on behalf of our audience you can hear that roar of applause that's coming across the virtual waves. Our thanks for challenging our assumptions and really giving us a framework as we move forward and talk to our partners and our clients about telework, new ways to frame the conversation that will hopefully push the numbers in the right direction. Those of you who are on the phone and have joined the program today, thanks for your attention and your interest. We appreciate you coming back to join us for these NET conferences on a periodic basis. As always, Phil Winters and I ask if you would please take a few minutes to fill out our survey. It helps us understand the topics that you are interested in. It helps us understand how to make the programs better, and we hope to better serve your needs. This program will be recorded and posted at the Nectar site in another day or two, so if there's something particular that you want to go back and check out, or if there's someone that you know would have found this program interesting and they missed it, you'll be able to point them in the right direction. So with that, thanks Kate and Tom, thanks audience, and I'm going to go home and figure out how I can telework tomorrow.
Thank you.